So we'll come back to looking at specific climate change evidences and impacts again to Europe. We haven't finished Europe yet, for example. So I will just read off some notes from the book chapter 8 called Climate and Agriculture. A little bit out of context, but these quotations from different sources give you a sense of how interpretations happen. So in his 2006 essay on cattle cults in relation to climatic change, De Lernia notes abrupt climate changes in marginal areas such as the central Sahara in the early and middle Holocene were among the major environmental constraints on prehistoric human groups. Okay, social responses to these events were different, with different paths and outcomes. The spread of cattle cult animals buried in megalithic stone structures in the Sahara at the end of the 7th millennium BP, so circa 6400 to 6000 year BP, so that's 7300 to 6800 years ago, is seen here as a collective ritual that emerged within Saharan pastoral societies to face uncertain climate and socially relate to superhuman entities. So every time there is a crisis, humans tend to reach out for help to superhuman entities, spiritual powers, God, whatever you want to call it. The type of rite, slaughtering of precious domestic livestock, reveals a shared identity in coping with catastrophic episodes, i.e. abrupt droughts. The spread of this cult over large parts of present-day Sahara is interpreted as the result of rapid movements of nomadic groups in search of pasture and water. Dramatic climatic deterioration at 5000 year BP or 5700 years ago is one of the causes of a further major social shift in rituals archaeologically detected by stone structures. These monuments become human burials, underlining a shift from social to individual identity as mirrored in the funerary traditions of later pastoral groups. So you can see here now we are doing sociological, anthropological interpretations of evidences like piles of bones and relating it to cattle cults and responses to climate perturbation. So it begins to go in a slightly different way than we have done so far. To look at more quotations, in Northeast Africa, the human responses to environmental change are described in terms of 4 phases of occupation of the western desert of Egypt and Libya. Obviously, greening would have created settlements, and then whether they decline or survive in the desert weather climate depends on the response. A first period of recolonization of the Sahara with the first cattle herders, a period of development with the introduction of sheep and goats and the development of nomad pastoralism. So a green Sahara would allow a cattle herding, but when rainfall becomes less and vegetation becomes scarcer or different, then ecotones change, then sheep and goats and nomadic pastoralisms become more viable. Then regionalization and marginalization, when people start to leave the desert area as it becomes too arid, diversifying or specializing their subsistence activities. The dynamics of Western Neolithic populations recall the 4 stages of Cooper, but the diet patterns do not. Okay, so the dynamics of Western Neolithic populations recall the 4 stages of Cooper, but the diet patterns do not. Okay, so that's the paper cited by Juice here. Furthermore, in the early Western African Neolithic, populations already exploited less diversified relic fish populations and hunted the few local ungulates, which are like horse-like creatures. When humans populations migrated southward, they encountered water and landscapes with more diversified fish and mammalian fauna and opportunistically exploited these resources. This model of opportunistic behavior can be used to characterize the main West African Neolithic populations according to Van Neer. The faunal diversity also explains why no preferential hunting focusing on a single taxon is known in these regions, as is the case in the Levant during the Neolithic with gazelles. Okay, Jauss, this is the quotation from him, concludes further that in West Africa the first desiccation pulse of the mid-Holocene period forced human populations to migrate and expand into newly explored regions where they found more varied food resources, climate and environment, which determine the basis of what can be selected and eaten, changed progressively or in punctuated stages until 2000 years before present. Humans exploited these resources in an opportunistic, flexible manner. No cultural revolution concerning subsistence strategies can be identified during the Neolithic. Only when resources became scarce, as climatic crisis strongly disturbed ecosystems during the transition to historical times, do people begin to specialize. In other words, it is when a catastrophic event occurs, where catastrophic denotes rapid and extreme changes, that perceptible impacts on human dietary customs become apparent. Aridity therefore appears as a forcing factor leading to cultural changes and social development. So how the climate change occurs, the rate at which changes happen, the slow decline of monsoon, disappearance of vegetation, changes in ecotones are expected to have different social response, cultural changes and so on, as opposed to dietary customs changing during rapid and extreme events. Okay, so this is to be kept in mind. Looking here at another paper now, coming back to text from elsewhere. Main social actions for coping dramatic change in rainfall on the basis of ethnographical inquiries in India and Tanzania. This is in modern times, trying to infer cattle people now and their response to climate perturbations to provide a context for the Holocene period changes. India, rainfall decreases from 327 to 159 millimeter per year. Then what do? Collecting weeds as fodder, harvesting field borders for fodder, harvesting premature crops, harvesting crops byproducts, more weeding, and lopping trees for fodder. In Tanzania, after the 1970s drought, a slow shift in climate, selling cattle to buy food, storing more than one season food when crop is good, so storing grains is very common even now, moving, asking for help from friends and relatives, weeding plots, not planting when rain is not enough, seems like a simple adjustment or adaptation, planting drought-resistant crops when they had the varieties, paying for rainmaker, you know what that is, praying and irrigation. Okay, so furthermore, in Mesopotamia, widely regarded as the first place for complex urban state, the first evidence of social stratification occurred about 7,000 years ago. Brooks further remarks, Algaze postulated a combination of changes in river courses and increasing aridity as drivers of increasing social complexity, stimulating social instability, regional competition and conflict, and population agglomeration. These processes appear to have been operating in Mesopotamia since the 8th millennium BP and to have accelerated towards the end of 6th millennium BP, encouraging what Hole refers to as the urban revolution. So there are climate-related perturbations like river courses and increasing aridity, but then social response is much more complicated. There is social complexity, social instability, regional competition and conflict, and population agglomeration. So, and urban revolution. So you can see how complicated the climate responses are. It's not always just environmental determinism and simple linear connecting of the dots from climate signals in paleoproxies to changes in regimes and so on, or societal collapses, as we said before. Another example, according to Hole 1994, these innovations take place in the context of a demographic crash which began about 5500 BC. Settlement in some regions disappears and in others declines rapidly. No region shows an increase in size and no region was newly opened to settlement. The pattern of gradual expansion across the arable landscape of the Near East by small villages begun by 7700 BC had ended. Now an increasing proportion of people resided in the larger towns and much of the landscape was devoid of settlement. Brooks adds that there was considerable trade between Uruk group and other places, including gemstones such as lapis lazuli and carnelian, plus stamp seals that indicate the development of administrative systems to control trade. The first true states appeared within Uruk culture in the 6th millennium BP. The Uruk period is associated with the mass production of pottery, the style of which differed significantly from Ubaid. The further development of accounting systems introduced before Ubaid, the introduction of writing and explicit representations of violence and authority. Also, drying trend made rich former swampland available for agriculture. So there you go. But there was competition for it. These multiple effects of climate change demonstrate the difficulty of simply relating the evolution of farming to isolated cases. So there is the region Uruk, Ur, Eridu, and the expansions around 4000 to 3100 BC during the Copper Age. Okay, so again, main point is that things are more complicated than simply assuming that environmental determinism works and that climate perturbations can be simply translated to agricultural changes or agricultural evolution and so on. Keeping that in mind, we'll come back and read a few more quotes from other sources from the book chapter and then conclude the chapter soon. It's a bit extensive, but it's worth going through all these because Holocene is a much closer period to where we evolved really into modern human beings, and there is much more evidence in all aspects of human natural system interactions, evolution of agriculture and transition to industrial revolution and technology. So that can then lead us to the next chapter where we look at how we are interacting with the environment and what it means for the future. Okay, that should conclude the course, but I will be adding material as they become available under new findings when we finish this part. Okay.